Welcome everyone. My name is Frank Kuppe and I am the coordinator of the Rethink project. The Rethink project is about developing innovative ways of doing science communication in the digital age. And on behalf of our entire project team, I would like to welcome you to this webinar that is about sense-making and the role of information and misinformation in this process of sense-making. In the past 6 or 7 months, we have taken the opportunity that the pandemic brought us to study how citizens across Europe make sense of this chaotic, confusing time, and how they figure out what's going on and what they should or could do. And for us, this has been a case study to explore how citizens make sense of science and how science communicators and scientists can tap into this process to maintain or improve the conversation about science in society. I am very happy that you are all here. It gives us an opportunity to present our results and also to get feedback from you. So for us, this meeting is not only about sending our broadcasting our findings to you, but it's also about opening up for your comments, feedback, and ideas that we can then incorporate into the next steps of our research. So that means that in the first part of this webinar, you will receive a number of talks. First of all, by Tessa Roedema. She's working as a researcher on this project, and she will present the outcomes of the research. Then I will continue to link the outcomes of the research to the issue of misinformation. And after that, we will break up in breakout rooms, and there we will have a discussion about our results, and we will open up our research to you. So we hope that you will stay with us for the entire time, but at the same time, feel free to get out of this what is useful for you. So having said all that, I would like to give the word to our host, Marcia, that will continue the session.
Thank you, Frank, and welcome to you all. So my name is Marta Mazzonetto, and I'm also involved in the Rethink project at an institution called SISA Media Lab based in Trieste in Italy. It is really nice to see so many of you here today. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tessa.
Yeah, thank you, Martia. I am Tessa Roedema. I work on the Rethink project as a PhD student. And I'm going to tell you a bit about the work we did on sense-making together with Virgil, who's also here in Zoom with us today, and Lisa, Amelie, and of course Frank, who will present a little bit after my presentation on our analysis of the dynamics of citizen sense-making practices across Europe. So I'm really glad that many people of you noted down understanding and also uncertainty, because that's exactly what we are going to talk about today. When we are talking about sense-making and the COVID-19 pandemic, we all have been confronted, of course, with these very difficult and uncertain times that the COVID-19 pandemic presents us with. And as you can see today, I am one of the lucky ones who can actually work at the university again behind my own desk. But of course, for many months also, I worked from home. And the COVID-19 pandemic not only impacted us in the sense that it impacted our work, but also it was very dominant in almost all aspects of our life, and it presented us with very complex and uncertain moments of which we needed to make sense, so of which we needed to provide new understanding or give meaning to. And what we see happening, or what we are confronted with every day, is that many different actors and voices contribute to our understanding of this COVID-19 pandemic. So in the news, you constantly hear and read about new scientific discoveries or measurements taken. Politicians also confront us with new measurements that we need to make sense of. And not only those experts or very professional actors provide us with new information or insights, but also our family and friends. We have, of course, often conversations with that make us give new insights or perspective on this COVID-19 pandemic. So what we see is that, especially online, scientific facts and opinions are increasingly mixed. A lot of different actors and also new actors interact with us on scientific topics such as COVID-19. And scientific facts are not only influenced by knowledge, but also emotions, the way we look at the world, our worldviews, perspectives that we have. And they involve dimensions that also are broadened to political aspects, economic aspects, medical aspects, social aspects, and ethical dimensions. And online we are therefore presented with an overload of information of which we need to make sense. And as of yet, it's unclear or uncertain who actually moderates or facilitates a constructive conversation about those topics. And that can maybe make explicit that all those different facets are involved when we need to make sense of a pandemic. So that's why we say that now a spotlight is placed on the way in which people make sense of the COVID-19 pandemic. So now individuals need to make sense of what information we look for, what information we trust, or how we relate to that information. And that is what we try to study in our most recent report on sense-making processes. So sense-making is the process by which we develop an understanding of a complex reality. And what we find is that previous experiences and knowledge, our underlying interests, values, and motives, and our social, cultural, and demographic backgrounds are really crucial factors that influence the way in which people make sense. And we state that sense making is a very dynamic process, so it's continuously changing and evolving. And that's also why I named this slide sense making and unmaking, because people continuously go through this process. So what we took is the sense-making theory of Darwin, which is normally a theory in the informational sciences, and applied it to the context of rethink. And what you see on the left is a person that stumbles upon a confusing situation in which you need to make sense. So we call that a gap, in which people are confronted with a situation which elicits new questions and also confusions. And then we try to make sense of that situation. So we take with us our personal situation and context. We look for relevances and sources, and we try to build a bridge over the gap, which is characterized by any beliefs that we have, values, emotions, thoughts, stories, and narratives. Once we have built that bridge, we come to a preliminary outcome in the situation, and that's an indication of anything that helps us or hinders us in making sense, and also consequences play a role here. So what we do is continuously move back and forth between stumbling upon new questions or confusions, trying to make sense, form a preliminary outcome, and then maybe make unsense again or start over. So this is why it's very dynamic and also complex to look at sense making. So what we did, and we didn't do this alone, but with a lot of fabulous people who conducted the interviews with us, is that we did 81 interviews throughout Europe in 8 countries in total: Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Serbia, Sweden, and the UK. And what we try to do with this is not provide a representative overview of participants and sense-making styles, but rather to focus on diversity over representativeness. So we try to find people living in different areas of the countries, having a wide variety of jobs and occupations, age groups, and also people who belong to different communities in our society. And we focused on a wide diversity of micro moments. So we asked participants to mention a moment that was very meaningful to them in this COVID-19 pandemic. And that situation we try to ask out. So this is again a stylized version of the sense making and unmaking figure that I just showed you. And I highlighted some of the questions that we asked. So in the beginning, we asked, what issue were you dealing with, or what was a very meaningful moment to you in which you needed to make sense? And we asked how that connected to people's past experiences to try to make that connection with personal situations and social context in which people found themselves. Then we asked for the questions and confusions that people had in their mind. So we asked what was confusing, what people tried to find out. And then we tried to find out what people actually had as a sense-making strategy, or how did they form the bridge over the gap. And lastly, we asked people what their preliminary outcome was and what helped them or hindered them in making sense. So what this looked like in practice, this is a filled-in figure that we made that covers all those aspects. And I realized that it's a lot of text on one slide. So I'm going to talk you through it very briefly, but if you want all the details, then I can gladly refer you to the report that we have made publicly available for you online. So this example concerns a mother from Poland. And what this example really shows to me is that personal situation and social context of people really plays a huge role when we talk about sense making. So this mother had a 5-year-old son who has health problems, and most of the questions and confusions that she struggled with related to that personal situation. So she wanted to find out what was the risk of COVID and how to deal with that in their daily life. So the bridging strategy that she took was to really find as much information as possible, both online and offline, and really try to look for expert knowledge that would tell her how to behave or how to get through this situation. And they decided to spend some time outside of Warsaw and go to a more rural area to her parents. And what was really remarkable to me was that this family had as a preliminary outcome to deal with sense making, and that they realized in hindsight the relief really came when she stopped analyzing and stopped gathering as much information as she could, and that really gave them relief. And then I have another example that was in some cases the complete opposite. This was a very skeptic student who was really very much doubting or mistrusting any authorities, and especially the government and media. So where the previous example really tried to look for those expertise knowledge, this person really tried to find their own sources and to try to make sense of, very contradictory, what we find contradictory information. But what was really interesting to me is that the bridging strategy between this very skeptical student and the mother was quite similar, in the sense that they both actively went online to do their own research and get informed. So that shows to me that even though we often talk about how people are different from each other, especially in how they deal with the COVID situation, some patterns that lie to the basis of that are actually quite similar. So in this next part, I will talk a bit about those individual themes that we found. So the first is personal situation, which we found was really decisive in sense making, and which at times also really outweighs information that people gather as a consequence of science communication practices. So important themes that emerged here were closeness, which was represented by the quote on the right from a participant from Italy who mentioned that it was really surreal to notice how silent the city was and how really disturbing that was. So closeness to the COVID-19 pandemic, how much you are confronted with it, was a really decisive factor here. Also vulnerability, so the quote of the mother already showed that if you have people in your environment who are more vulnerable, that also impacted how you behave or relate to the COVID-19 pandemic. Occupation was a big factor. So if you had an occupation that was already quite much reliant on scientific knowledge, and then you also can rely to it more or trust it more. So for example, the quote on the right that says, "I really believe that we have truly excellent doctors and experts. I'm sure of this. I worked so many years in that field." So really no doubt in that sense that science is really providing. And then the circle of family and friends was really important. So many people mentioned to talk a lot about COVID-19 with family and friends, and that gave them different perspectives on the same issues, changed their behavior, or made them more certain of that how they behaved was working well. Second part, sense making, is questions and confusions that we are confronted with. And here we saw two types of questions and confusions, which was uncertainties. So those mostly regarded scientific uncertainties, in the sense that people really wanted to know how dangerous COVID-19 is, how it impacts our society, how it's transferred between people, and what we can do about it. And the second type of question that people had in their minds were fundamental ambiguities, and that mostly regarded contradictory things in the information that gets to us, things mentioned by politicians that didn't seem to add up at some points, or when new measurements were introduced but later reversed. That proved to be most frustrating thing in making sense, and also giving rise to a lot of questions and doubts. So that's illustrated by the quote on the right saying, "So much contradictory and controversial information appears on television that you no longer know what to believe and what not, or what to do and what not to do." The third part of sense making regards the sense making strategies, or how we bridge those gaps. And we found a plethora of bridges, which mostly concerned beliefs and worldviews, trust as well. So either trusting large institutions or not. So the second thing that people really mentioned as a bridging factor was the use of information. So a lot of people mentioned that they started looking for more information online, for example, on how long they have to stay at home, what distance you have to keep from other people. So really the knowledge behind COVID. And thirdly, emotions, which is illustrated by the quote on the right, quite an intense quote. Hate, I felt pure hate. I just cannot understand why people would behave that way. So this was one way in which people tried to make sense of what was going on. It was a very emotional response. This is a negative emotion, but there were also a lot of positive emotions, luckily. For example, of people who felt pride in how they handled the COVID situation, how people sometimes got together more, and also reuniting to feel more resilient to deal with this COVID-19 pandemic. And what is striking here is that not a lot of people explicitly refer to sources that they used. So that is the second slide here, sources and relevances. So people mostly mentioned perspectives of family and friends. So really the social factor is quite crucial when we talk about sense making. So this was more often mentioned than actually information that got to them through science communication practices. For example, people would mention, I would probably get my information from my friends and family who work in the NHS, so the public health sector. I trust them a lot more. And then how people formed their preliminary outcome or conclusion, that was found to really help people to get some relief in cutting to the point and formulate a temporary understanding. They did that by estimating the danger of the virus or the impact on society and adapt certain behaviors to that. So people might say, for example, I may have broken the rules, but I thought it was justified, just to get some temporary relief and conclusion to what is going on. And it showed that sense making is very dynamic, emotional, and stressful. So hindrances were stress and fatigue. For example, people mentioned to stop following the news, to get some relief and to not be busy with the situation continuously, and trying to find assurance. So that is, for example, shown by the quote of the mother in Poland who decided to move to outside of an urban area to a rural area. And she mentioned that that was purely an emotional analysis based on the need to be outside of that urban area. And she specifically mentions that they did not come to that preliminary outcome based on a rational analysis of the situation, but really emotional. So to conclude, what we found is that sense making mainly relies on personal situations, emotions, worldviews, and rarely explicitly refers to science communication channels. And that's, of course, very sobering insight for the science communication practice as it is. So what we try to research with the Rethink project is to find those strategies that really connect with those diverse and personal sense-making practices. And I'm leaving you with a lot of questions, I hope, that we can discuss in the breakout room later. So with that, I want to thank you for listening to those results. And hopefully I can get the chance to talk to you about how this connects to practice of science communication in a breakout room later.
Thank you very much, Tessa. And as you mentioned, we will have plenty of time for discussing and for addressing your question. Thank you. I've seen some of you have already started writing on the Padlet. So I'm going to ask Frank I think, Frank, you probably need to share your screen. And Frank is actually the coordinator of our Rethink project. Here you go. Now you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, here I go. I think one of the interesting things of this home working that we are forced to do in the past months is that you see more of people's backgrounds, people's living situation, which of course fits the topic of sense making very well, because also here we try to really move into the lived experience of people themselves, rather than start thinking about public understanding and public communication from our own scientific point of view and point of departure. So what I would like to do now in this next 10 minutes is to link the research outcomes that Tessa has just presented to you with the topic of misinformation, which just as the coverage of the pandemic itself has gained a lot of attention as well, because misinformation is of course an issue when you really want people to understand what's going on, and when you really want people to adhere to certain measures, or to collectively take care of oneself, each other, and our societies. However, the sense-making perspective does have some challenges for this misinformation approach. And that is what I want to talk to you now about. So first of all, how does sense-making connect to misinformation? As Tessa has showed us, we are living in uncertain times that are characterized by chaos, by confusion. So we have to ask this sense-making question: what's going on here? And also, what should we do? So we need to figure this out, and we need to get bits and fragments of information. We need to engage collectively in a sense-making process where we start finding, using, sharing, generating information. And according to a cross-national analysis that was done in April and May last year, 15 to 37% of the interviewees that were either from South or North America or from Europe believed misinformation about COVID-19. We have to ask ourselves the question, of course, what does this mean that these people believe misinformation? And usually from the misinformation perspective, then people start to think about, or scholars, scientists start to reflect on questions like, how do people evaluate information? And one of the influential authors in the misinformation research, Schwartz, already a few decades ago argued that it has to do with criteria like these. So the compatibility of information, well, with their understanding of what's the case, the credibility of the information, the internal logical consistency, the evidence supporting that information, but also, and this is something that comes out of our research as well, what others think. As Tessa showed you, a lot of times we encountered that both the confusion as well as the bridging strategy originates from encounters, social encounters with others. If you have figured out what a kind of bit of information, for example, transmission rate in the open air, what that means and what to do, I adhere to the social distancing measures, and you see others in your surrounding not adhere to those measures, then your sense making starts over again. Now, another focus of misinformation research is on the people that spread misinformation. We are talking here not about people getting it wrong or making mistakes, but about people intentionally spreading misinformation. And Sander van der Linden, another influential author in misinformation research, listed a number of dimensions of this spread of misinformation. For example, impersonation, conspiracy, polarization, and trolling. This is a focus, this lays the focus on the people that are sending the misinformation. Now, in the next slides, I would like to challenge these approaches based on our research. So, if we say countering misinformation, then we usually think about countering people like we see here, that are protesting against national policies, or protesting against a local Center for Disease Control, because they say we have to wake up, we have to know the truth, we are lied to, there is something going on that we do not understand and that is going wrong. So is the problem, what makes these people go here? Is that really that they do not have the right information? Or is there something else that's going on? Are they here because this is what their friends and family tell them? Or are they here because they really don't trust their government and their institutions? So they tend to see this as another example of how they are marginalized. So why are they here? That's an important first question. And then the other question is providing these people with the right information making them leave, or making them adhere to the dominant consensus or the measures that are taken? So is that the right way to approach these people? Now, I think our sense-making research points at a few different themes that show that we might need to do something else as well. And that doesn't mean that I'm saying that what's happening when people are intentionally spreading misinformation, that is right, that is can lead to dangerous situations. But the question is, do we understand well enough what's going on there? First of all, based on our sense-making research, we can say that misinformation research has a too narrow focus on information, whereas our research shows that information is only a small part of sense-making. There are a lot of other aspects like emotions or relations or worldviews that are important drivers of the sense-making process. And I think it's a well-known principle of communication that if you don't relate, you also cannot communicate. So relations are here, I think, a crucial factor. Also, our research shows that misinformation research often relies on what I personally call a too comfortable framing of us versus them. If we do not question, we do not have to question ourselves if we think about the bad guys that are spreading misinformation. And the only thing that we need to do is to provide them with the right information. Now, what our research shows is that actually the picture of an individual making sense in a social and political environment is much more complex. And the way that bits of information are understood and put together, integrated into a whole picture of what's going on, is influenced, for example, by very basic relationships that people have with the world around them, their government and institutions in their society. So instead of thinking about this in an us versus them framing, we should really try to figure out how people individually and collectively make sense of what they experience. The third implication of our research for misinformation research is that it often disregards the nature of knowledge. What we see is that knowledge about the pandemic, this is, I think, true for every any kind of knowledge of the world we live in, but especially in such a crisis situation as the pandemic, you can witness live that knowledge is complex. So is related to a number of different dimensions and contexts, and it's also uncertain and ambiguous. Not only uncertain because we don't get the science right, but also uncertain because the way the pandemic evolves is so complex that you cannot predict everything that comes out. Ambiguous in the terms that how you think and about these uncertainties and evaluate them depends on the perspective you take. So science is a social process, and human choices determine what counts and what does not count. And in that way, weaving together facts and norms. And the difficulty, I think, in the public debate about the pandemic is that it's hard to disentangle those facts and norms and values. And at the same time, you cannot solve the discussion by simply claiming the facts. And finally, misinformation research often puts too much emphasis on critical, rational judgment, whereas we have seen that sense-making is a real-world process. And it is highly contextual in the sense that people's own situations, relations, and backgrounds are important determinants of the sense-making process. It is also action-oriented, which means that people don't need to decide what's true or not. The most important thing for them is to take the next step. And this next step is always taken in uncertainty and in clarity. So, what can or should we do? I think the sense-making perspective shows us that this sense-making process is not something that stops or ends, but it's something that goes on continuously. And therefore, instead of telling people what they should know, we should, as science communication community, seek how we can intensify society's dialogue with itself. Some core ingredients of this approach could be humility about the role of scientific knowledge, openness about the scientific process, and reflective practice of scientists and science communicators to be able to recognize and adapt to the perspectives of other people in society while we are communicating knowledge. But these are just a few starting points. After our break, we really would like to talk to you about our outcomes, about these ideas, and about the next steps in our research, as well as in science communication as a practice. For now, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you very much, Tessa. So I'm keeping an eye on the Padlet where some of you have been sharing some comments and questions. Thank you very much about this. I think one interesting comment that has been coming up, and please don't hesitate to keep writing there. So I guess some comments hint to the fact that you kind of need to ask people the question about which sources do they trust. So maybe there is a bit of curiosity about how we have done or not done this in sense making. So concrete questions like how do people looked for certain type of information or decided to trust misinformation or not. And I think it has really emerged already quite a lot in both your presentations, but maybe we can stress a bit more the importance of not having asked such direct questions in our interviews about what do they prioritize, how do they trust a certain type of information or not, etc. So I don't know if maybe Frank or Tessa would like to add something about this.
Yeah,
can you say something about it?
I think I can definitely say something about this, because trust was something that was a dominant theme throughout many of the interviews that we conducted. And people did display some sort of preliminary fixed idea about if they trusted the government, yes or no, or if they trusted larger institutions, yes or no. And what was, I think, remarkable in that sense is that it's the underlying values or the closeness to that feels really the personal situation and context that determined if people did trust it or not, and try to relate themselves to what they saw in their environment. So having conversations with family members. Exactly the factors for the trust. So how did they come to that trust? We, I think, didn't really cover in the interviews that we did, but it was quite a dominant theme that people referred to a lot in regards to sense making. So basically, it was quite. People refer to it quite explicitly, stating, I trust the government or I trust media, but didn't really give away why they trusted or not trusted. But we could relate that to their personal experiences with institutions or with certain larger institutions or thoughts in society. But yeah, maybe a valuable point to dive further into in the coming time period.
Yes, definitely. And I see also you are also answering some of the comments that have been emerging in the chat. There are quite a lot of comments focusing on misinformation itself. There's an interesting comment on, sorry, I'm trying to read, but they keep moving on science communication and uncertainty. Someone wrote, I think science communicators sometimes fear that communicating uncertainty will have a negative impact in changing people's attitudes and behaviors, despite the research showing that confidence intervals, talking about limitations of current knowledge, etc., doesn't really impact adhesion that much. So there is also a link to an interesting paper. Let me just check whilst questions keep appearing. There was one, but it disappeared. Someone was also commenting on the type of misinformation, and I think this has also been coming up in one of the questions in the chat about the different types of misinformation that you can have there. So when talking about misinformation, it is really important to ask what kind of misinformation we are dealing with. So do people, for example, believe the virus does not exist, or is it fabricated, etc.? So do they simply have the wrong information, or is it actually different types of misinformation that is getting to them? I don't know if anyone of the researchers would like to add a comment on this. I don't see any other questions at the moment, but you can, of course, write more questions there.
Yes, I can respond to that. And as I also said in the chat, indeed, the distinction between misinformation and disinformation, for example, is usually the matter of intent. Are people intentionally misleading or spreading wrong or false information without being aware of it? And I think for our purposes, this emphasis on intent is not so useful because, well, for one, it portrays, in my view, it portrays the people that are spreading misinformation as quite passive, so they spread it without knowing. And second, there is always a degree of strategy or strategic communication or interests and values as part of the sense-making process. So what I mean with that is that people are attracted to false information because it fits with their confusions, and it fits with the bridging strategies that they undertake. So and it also matters to them. And maybe they are not willingly misleading people or setting up a disinformation campaign. But I think it is important to look at these relationships between, what is the information that people find and also share, and how they feel about that information and the ways in which that matters to them. So that is why, we have in our research actually not looked at that distinction that much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Frank and Tessa. So as we mentioned, we have now plenty of time to keep discussing about this research that our colleagues have just presented.